Hello everybody, this is Refresh, and I'm here to bring you a battle between these two Dominaria Planeswalker decks. Over here we have Teferi, and over there we have Chandra's deck. We'll be playing the best of 3, and we will roll to see who goes first. Teferi has 5. Chandra has 5. We'll roll again. Chandra has 8. Teferi has 8. We'll roll again. Teferi has 12. Chandra has 10. Teferi will opt to go first. Teferi draws 7. We have a Zahid Jinn of the Lamp, a Juggernaut, Knight of New Benalia, Daring Archaeologist, Meandering River, and Plains. This is a bit of a risky keep, but we do have 2 Knights of New Benalia that we can play. So we will go ahead and keep this hand. Chandra will draw 7. Chandra has a Carplusin Hound, a Pyromantic Pilgrim, a Gilded Lotus, Grun the Lonely King, a Mountain, Elfheim Druid, and Forest. This is a bit of a risky keep as well, but because of the Mountain and the Forest, and the fact that an Elfheim Druid could get us to 3 mana, I think it's also worth keeping, so we will keep this hand. Turn 1, Teferi will play a Meandering River tapped, and Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra will draw. She draws a forest. She'll play the forest, and Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws. He draws an island. He will play the plains and tap both the Meandering River and the plains, and then play a Knight of New Benalia. It is a 3/1 human knight, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra draws. She draws a fire elemental. She'll play the mountain and tap the mountain and the forest, and she will play the Elfheim Druid, and then she will pass the turn. Teferi will untap. Teferi will draw. He draws a plains. We will play the island, and then we will attack with the Knight of New Benalia for 3. Chandra will decline to block and will take 3 to go down to 17. On his second main step, he will tap the plains and the island and play a second Knight of New Benalia, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws and gets a Marwyn the Nurturer. Chandra will play the forest, and Chandra will tap 3 mana to play Marwyn the Nurturer, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws and gets an island. Teferi will play the second plains, and then Teferi will attack with both Knights of New Benalia. Chandra will decline to block and go to 11. Teferi will follow up by tapping everything and then playing the Juggernaut. The Juggernaut says that it attacks each combat if able, and it can't be blocked by walls, and Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws and gets a Gift of Growth. Chandra will tap everything for 5 mana and play a Gilded Lotus, and then Chandra will tap the Gilded Lotus to play a Pyromantic Pilgrim, which is a 3/1 with haste. Chandra will not attack, and Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws and gets a Temporal Machinations. Teferi will play the island, and Teferi will tap the island and 2 plains to play Temporal Machinations, returning the Pyromantic Pilgrim to Chandra's hand. And if he controls an artifact, he'll draw a card, which he does, so he'll draw a card, getting a Meandering River and putting that in his hand. Chandra picks up the Pyromantic Pilgrim. On his second main step, Teferi will attack with both Knights of New Benalia and the Juggernaut for 11 damage. Chandra cannot block and can't cast anything, so she takes 11 damage and perishes. Looks like Teferi got off to an aggro start, and we will be right back for game 2. Chandra chooses to go first. Game 2, we'll draw 7. She gets a Llanowar Elves, a Carplusin Hound, an Elfheim Druid, a Mountain, a Pyromantic Pilgrim, a Timber Gorge, and a Carplusin Hound. I think this is enough to get started with 2 sources of ramp and both colors of mana. Teferi draws 7. He gets a Daring Archaeologist, an Aether Glider, a Befuddle, a Knight of New Benalia, a Plains, and a Temporal Machinations. This isn't a great hand because we are missing a color, but we only have 2 cards of that color, and we can cast the Knight of New Benalia, drawing 1 more land to get us to the Aether Glider. So I think this is a risky keep, but we will keep this hand. Chandra will go first. She'll play the Timber Gorge tapped, and then we'll pass the turn. Teferi draws. and gets a plains, he'll play the plains and he'll pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws and gets a forest. Chandra will play the forest. Chandra will tap the Timber Gorge and the forest to play an Elfheim Druid, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi will draw. He draws an island. He'll play the island. He'll tap both and then play Knight of New Benalia, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra will draw and get a Fiery Intervention. Chandra will play a mountain, and then Chandra will tap the Elfheim Druid for green to play a Llanowar Elves, and she'll also tap the remaining lands to play a Pyromantic Pilgrim, which comes in as a 3/1, and then Chandra will attack with the Pyromantic Pilgrim. Teferi will decline to block and will take 3 to go to 17. Then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws and gets an island. Teferi will play the plains. Teferi will attack with the Knight of New Benalia. Chandra declines to block and will take 3 to go to 17. Teferi will follow up by tapping all the mana and playing an Aether Glider. It's flying and it can't block. And then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws and gets a Krosan Druid. Chandra will attack with the Pyromantic Pilgrim as well as the Llanowar Elves. Teferi can't block, will take 4 damage and go to 13. Second main, Chandra will tap everything and then play a Karplusan Hound. And then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a Meandering River. Teferi will attack with just the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra declines to block, takes 2 and goes to 15. On his second main phase, Teferi will play a Meandering River tapped, and then Teferi will tap the rest to play Temporal Machinations, returning the Karplusan Hound to Chandra's hand. And then, because Teferi controls an artifact in the Aether Glider, Teferi will draw a card. Chandra picks up the Karplusan Hound, and Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws and gets a forest. Chandra will play the forest. Chandra will attack with the Llanowar Elves and the Pyromantic Pilgrim. Teferi will trade the Knight of New Benalia with the Pyromantic Pilgrim. The Knight dies. The Pilgrim dies. Teferi takes 1 damage and goes to 12. Second main, Chandra will tap everything except for the Elfheim Druid and play a Karplusan Hound again. And then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws and gets a Meandering River. Teferi will play the Meandering River tapped, and then Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider. Chandra can't block, will take 2 and go to 13. And Teferi will then pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws. She gets a Baloth Gorger. Chandra will attack with the Karplusan Hound. Teferi will tap both planes and play Gideon's Reproach on the Karplusan Hound, dealing 4 damage to that attacking creature. The Karplusan Hound dies. On Chandra's second main phase, she'll tap all the lands and then play the other Karplusan Hound, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws and gets a plains. Teferi is flooding out. Teferi will play the island. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra can't block, will take 2 and go to 11. On the second main step, Teferi will tap everything else and play a Daring Archaeologist. It says when Daring Archaeologist enters the battlefield, you may return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand, but there are no artifacts in here. Whenever you cast a historic spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Daring Archaeologist, and then we will pass the turn. Chandra will untap. Chandra draws and gets a Fight with Fire. Chandra will tap the Timber Gorge, both forests, and the Elfheim Druid to play Fiery Intervention on the Daring Archaeologist. It says Fiery Intervention deals 5 damage to target creature. The Daring Archaeologist dies. Chandra will attack with the Karplusan Hound. Teferi cannot block, will take 3 damage and go to 9. Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets an island, continues flooding, will play the plains, and then Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider. Chandra cannot block, will take 2 and go to 9. Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, gets a Shivan Fire. Chandra will attack with the Llanowar Elves and the Karplusan Hound for 4. Teferi will tap the island and the 2 planes to befuddle the Karplusan Hound, giving it -4/-0 till end of turn. And then we'll draw a card, getting a Joyous Familiar. We'll take 1 damage from the Llanowar Elves to go to 8. On the second main phase, Chandra will tap the Timber Gorge, both forests, and the Elfheim Druid and play a Baloth Gorger, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a Knight of New Benalia. Teferi will play the island. Teferi will play Joyous Familiar and the Knight of New Benalia. And Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra cannot block, will take 2 and go to 7. Then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra will untap. Chandra will draw and get a Marwyn the Nurturer. Chandra will cast Fight with Fire, targeting the Joyous Familiar to deal 5 damage to it. And will also tap for red and cast the Sheep and Fire, targeting the Knight of Benalia to do 1 damage to it. Both creatures die. Then Chandra will tap with the Baloth Gorger, the Llanowar Elves, and Karplusan Hound for 8 damage. Teferi has only 8 life, so he'll lose it and perish. Game 2 goes to Chandra. We'll clean everything up and prepare for Game 3. For Game 3, Teferi will opt to go first. He'll draw 7. He gets a Gideon's Reproach, Befuddle, Meandering River, Teferi Sentinel, Island, and Aether Glider. This is not an ideal hand, but we do have a bit of defense and a way to start getting in for damage, so we will keep this hand. Chandra draws 7. She gets a Fire Elemental, a Forest, a Mountain, Marwyn the Nurturer, Timber Gorge, Baloth Gorger, and Forest. This hand isn't great, but we can get to Marwyn and then power out a Fire Elemental or a Baloth Gorger, so we will go ahead and keep this hand as well. Turn 1, Teferi will play a Meandering River tapped, and Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra draws, gets a Primordial Worm. Chandra will play the Timber Gorge tapped, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps, Teferi draws, gets a Temporal Machinations. Teferi will play an island, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps, Chandra draws, gets a Pyromantic Pilgrim. Chandra will play the forest, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi draws, he gets an island. Teferi will play the island. Teferi will tap everything, and then play an Aether Glider, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra draws, she gets a mountain. Chandra will play the mountain. Chandra will tap everything and then play Marwyn the Nurturer. Whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Marwyn the Nurturer. Then you can tap to add an amount of green equal to Marwyn's power. She's a 1/1. And then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a Gideon's Reproach. Teferi plays another island. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider. Chandra cannot block, takes 2, and goes to 18. Teferi will tap out, and then play Temporal Machinations, returning Marwyn the Nurturer to Chandra's hand. And then because he controls an artifact, he will draw a card, which is another island. Chandra picks up Marwyn the Nurturer, and then Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, she gets an Elfheim Druid. Chandra will play a forest. Chandra will tap again and play Marwyn the Nurturer a second time. And then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a plains. Teferi will play the plains. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider. Chandra takes 2, goes to 16. Teferi will follow up by tapping everything, and then playing Teferi Sentinel. It's a 2/6. As long as you control a Teferi Planeswalker, it gets +4/+0. Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, gets a mountain. Chandra will play a mountain. Chandra will tap a forest and a mountain, and then play Elfheim Druid. It's an elf. As it enters the battlefield, Marwyn will get a +1/+1 counter. And then we will tap the remaining forest, Timber Gorge, mountain, and Marwyn for 2 mana, for a total of 5 mana, and play the Fire Elemental as well. And then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a plains. Teferi will play the plains. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra takes 2, goes to 14. Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, gets a mountain. Chandra will play the mountain. Chandra will attack with the Fire Elemental. Teferi taps a Plains and an Island and plays a Gideon's Reproach on the Fire Elemental, dealing it 4 damage. Fire Elemental dies. Second main phase, Teferi will tap the Elfhame Druid and all the lands for 8 mana, using the kicker ability to Baloth Gorger to put it into play with 3+1/+1 counters on it, making it a 7/7, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws. Gets another Plains. Teferi will play the Plains. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider. Chandra cannot block, will take 2 and go to 12. And Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws. Gets a Pyromantic Pilgrim. Chandra will play the next mountain. Chandra will attack with the Baloth Gorger for 7. Teferi will block with the Teferi Sentinel. After blocks are declared, Teferi will play Befuddle on the Baloth Gorger, making it -4/-0, and then draw a card. Teferi draws an island. The creatures bounce off of each other. Chandra's second main phase, she will tap all of her lands and cast a Primordial Worm, which is a 7/6, and then Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets another land, will play the island. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra cannot block, will take it, going to 10. And Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, gets a Timber Gorge. Chandra will play the Timber Gorge tapped. Chandra will attack with the Primordial Worm and the Baloth Gorger for 14 damage. Teferi will block the Primordial Worm with the Teferi Sentinel, chopping. Teferi Sentinel dies. Before the end of combat, Teferi will tap a Plains and an Island. Teferi will also take 7 damage from the Baloth Gorger, going down to 12. Before the end of combat, Teferi will tap the Plains and the Island and play the Gideon's Reproach, dealing 4 additional damage to finish off the Primordial Worm. Primordial Worm dies, and Chandra passes turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets Yambi, Faithful Healer. Teferi will play a Plains. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra takes 2 and goes to 8. Teferi taps 3 mana and will play Nyambi, Faithful Healer. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library and or graveyard for a card named Teferi Timebender, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. She comes in as a 2/2. We're searching for Teferi. Here's Teferi Timebender. We'll put him into our hand and shuffle. With the remaining mana, we'll tap it all and play Teferi Timebender. He enters the battlefield with 5 loyalty counters. We will immediately -3 Teferi, go to 2, and then gain 2 life to go back up to 14. And we'll draw 2 cards, a Plains and a Temporal Machinations, and then we will pass the turn. Chandra untaps, gets an Elfhame Druid. Chandra will tap 2, play the Elfhame Druid, making Marwyn into a 3/3, and we will tap the remaining mana to play 2 Pyromantic Pilgrims. We will attack with Marwyn the Nurturer, Baloth Gorger, and both Pyromantic Pilgrims for 16 damage. Chandra loses a Pyromantic Pilgrim, and Chandra will pass the turn. Teferi untaps. Teferi draws, gets a Gideon's Reproach. Teferi will play Temporal Machinations on the Baloth Gorger, returning it to Chandra's hand, and then draw a card because he controls an artifact, which is a Meandering River, continuing the endless cycle of land drawing. Teferi will play the Meandering River. Teferi will attack with the Aether Glider for 2. Chandra cannot block, will go to 6. Teferi will +2 on himself to untap the Aether Glider. Teferi will play a Plains, and Teferi will pass the turn. Chandra forgot to pick up the Baloth Gorger. We'll do that now. Chandra untaps. Chandra draws, gets another Baloth Gorger. Chandra attacks with Marwyn the Nurturer and the Pyromantic Pilgrim. Teferi taps a Plains and an Island and casts Gideon's Reproach, dealing 4 damage to Marwyn the Nurturer. Marwyn dies. Teferi takes 3 damage from the Pyromantic Pilgrim and perishes, giving Chandra the win. Chandra wins game 3 for 2 wins, winning the match. Let me know what you think about these games in the comments below. If I made any errors, both in terms of rules or gameplay errors, let me know and I will attempt to do better in the future. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you'd like to see more such videos, hit subscribe. Next time I'll be pitting these two decks up against the Face the Hydra challenge deck from Theros. Until then, thanks for watching, and this was Refresh.